all of Elgin. When Elgin does well, all the communities in Elgin do well. And I welcome everybody here to Elgin, and I think that's really about it. This is Anthony. He's new on the city council.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anthony Ortega. I'm Elgin City Councilman with Ms. Martinez, and I'm here to learn and see what we could do to strive to make Elgin better.
And I know you were already sort of introduced, but you're also an elected official, so.
Sergio Rodriguez, buenas tardes, Elgin Community College Board of Trustee. And I just want to add one more thing. Dr. Sam said some wonderful things, but I cannot miss saying this. Elgin Community College not only is a Hispanic Servant Institute, it is one of the top 25 community colleges in the country. Of the 1,047 community colleges, this is one of the top 25.
Hi, everyone. I'm here on behalf of State Representative Mark Walker of the 53rd District. Thank you.
Is that it? Well, we want to thank you for being here and really thank you for your presence, because a lot of what we're talking about today really is going to require policy change, and we hopefully are setting the stage for what that can look like here in the future. So now I'd like to turn it over to our other partner, the wonderful Dr. Teresa Córdova from the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois, Chicago.
Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for welcoming us here to Elgin. The first question I guess I have for you all is how many of you, first of all, how many students from Elgin Community College are in the house? We got students in the house? How many of you are from Elgin or from the Elgin area? Lots of you. Well, we thank you for welcoming us here. And I want to begin by really paying respects to Elgin and people who've been in Elgin, either have come more recently who have been here for a very long time. We know that Elgin was settled initially by a Latino, or Latinos first came to Elgin, at least that I know of, in the 20s, and came really with the railroad industry, and a lot of them worked in the railroad industry. But a lot of folks came to the Elgin area. I'm not telling you things you don't know, but came to the Elgin area, for example, in the surrounding area, and worked in agriculture. Folks who came maybe from Texas, people like Roberto Carmona's family, for example, who came to the Elgin region and settled here, went to the schools here. And so we recognize that Elgin is one of the oldest, one of the suburbs with the longest standing Latino population. And I think that's important to recognize that while Elgin, for example, had such a high growth of population in the last 10 years, the rate of population growth was very high, and I think you increased the numbers of Latinos into Elgin by over 7,000 people, but you also have a really old population here. So hats off to the folks from Elgin. And then I also wanted to know, is Professor, by any chance, Professor Antonio Ramirez in the house? Okay, can you please stand, Professor? I mean, I imagine that people from Elgin know you, know who you are, but I can't come into your house and not express my appreciation to you, my acknowledgement of you. Professor Ramirez is a professor of history here, and he has a project that you can find on his website, Chicagolandia, is that what it's called? And what's really cool about it, he's got a lot of oral histories on there, and people who've been in Elgin for a long time, people who emerged as leaders and so on. And I know you speak about Latinos in the suburbs and Latinos in Elgin, so I very much want to thank you for allowing us to be here, and I'm so glad that you're here with us, and we'll look forward to any comments you might have after our presentation. So thank you, Professor.
And let me add to it, he is ECC's Professor of the Year.
Oh, I'm not surprised, yes. Thank you very much. Well, one of the important things about this report, it really adds to the growing recognition of the importance of Latinos to the Chicagoland economy. And our importance is represented in our role as essential workers. We certainly found that out during the pandemic, but we have long time been really important workers to the economy. Our presence in the economy has made a huge difference as workers, but also as entrepreneurs, all of our small businesses, for example, as homeowners, as consumers, and more. So I think one of the most important things to note about our increasing presence in Chicago, in the Chicagoland area, in Chicano or Chicagolandia, as you refer to it, and throughout the state of Illinois, that our very presence is saving the economy, is providing the much-needed growth. We are very important, and I think this report represents that growing recognition from a lot of different sectors, how important Latinos are to the Chicagoland area. So I want to sort of end with that and join our partners. We were really happy to partner with MPC and Latino Policy Forum in doing this report, and acknowledge also from Great Cities Institute, one of the co-authors of it, Alex Linares, who is, as you point out, wonderful to work with. And then also take note, too, that Noreen Sagru, you're here. Thank you for your role. And is Chris here, too, as well? And Chris, so three of them are some, oh, there's Alex. Okay, Alex, Chris, and Noreen are also I know I'd seen you a minute ago, right? So I want to take note of our co-authors on this report, or the authors of the report. So with that, I turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. David Sam, Sylvia Puente, Darlene, Oliver Hightower, and Professor Córdova. We want to introduce one other person on this panel today, Daniel Cooper, who's the Senior Director of Research at the Metropolitan Planning Council.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on what is the hottest day of the year. It's inspiring to see you all out here, keeping cool in the auditorium. So I'm going to take us through some high-level findings of the report, and if we can pull up the PowerPoint. My job here today is to set the stage with the 30,000-foot view of what we found in the report in terms of Latino population change. And primarily in the report, we were looking over the last decade, from 2010 to 2020. So our story begins really with something probably most of you, if not all of you here, know, which is the Latino population is the biggest driver of population growth in this region. That's been true now for a number of years. The Latino population here in the region has more than doubled since 1990. And although we no longer are seeing the same explosive growth rates that we saw at the end of the 20th century and in the early 2000s, the Latino population is still very much growing and growing fast. And so if you pay attention to the news, you probably often hear every year or every time a census comes out that Chicago is lowest on the list in terms of population growth. We're outpaced by Houston or other cities. And more so than a bragging right, we think that there's a missed story here, or several missed stories. One, it isn't just about growth. It's about what populations are growing the region, and are we taking care of those populations? So one of the things this report aims to do is to take a deep dive on our fastest growing segment of population, Latinos, to make sure that they're fully integrated in the economy in ways that are commensurate with their contributions. So the graphs here kind of take us through a high level look at what's happened over the last decade. Latinos are growing much faster in the suburbs than in Chicago, although the Latino population has still been growing in Chicago, in the city proper, not as fast as the suburbs. Now more than 400,000 Latinos live in the suburbs in our region than they do in the city. So the suburbs represent the fastest segment of growth for Latino populations. That's true of all of Illinois. And the second graph on the right, you see the comparison between the Latino and non-Latino population. And in green, you see the growth rates of Latino population. And so the point here is our region would be shrinking without Latinos growing. The Latino population is the reason this region is growing. Otherwise, it would not be. And again, this is important not just for bragging rights. It's important because this population growth brings investment. Think federal investment in infrastructure, which we've seen in the past few years, but also private sector investment. This is jobs, as my colleague Teresa mentioned. This is new businesses starting. The point is Latinos make a critical contribution to the region, to the economic, cultural vitality. And the partners here in this report wanted to take a deeper dive to make sure that the lives of Latinos are the health and vitality of Latino families is commensurate with their contribution to the region's health. So in the next slide, we take a closer look at county by county, and you can really see across the region this difference between Latino population growth and non-Latino population growth. In every single county of our region, the Latino population is growing. And that's especially true in some of our collar counties like Kendall, McHenry, Will, and Lake, where the growth rates are much higher than many of the other regions. And it should be noted, in only one other county did the non-Latino population grow, and that was Kendall over the last 10 years. So again, this is an important finding and often missing from the headlines when we hear anything about population change. The Latino population is critical and also represents the fastest segment of buying power in our entire region. A quote that sticks out from a conversation the Latino Policy Forum held with stakeholders, a woman said, "If you pay me $20 an hour, I might buy one thing, but if you pay me $40 an hour, I will buy two things, and that's good for everybody." So that illustrates the point. And we think we need to pay closer attention to this, and my colleagues will do a deep dive in a second in terms of what challenges and opportunities those bring. Next slide. So here's where I'm going to close with my overview, and I'm going to show you two maps, and it shows you how maps can both be illuminating, but also misleading. The first map is a population density map, so this shows us where we see the biggest clusters of Latino population, and here we see places like Elgin and Waukegan and Aurora, where I grew up, and Berwyn, Cicero, and near West Cook County neighborhoods that have high Latino populations. But what we see in the map on the right is where we've seen the fastest growth in Latino populations. And here we've noted in the report basically two rings of growth. One in the inner ring suburbs, like Melrose Park, Berwyn, Cicero, like I mentioned, but also the far-flung collar counties. And you can see in the dark green, these are areas where we're seeing huge growing Latino population farther away from the downtown urban core. And this is interesting for a number of reasons, because this brings up a whole new set of opportunities for Latinos, which my colleagues will discuss, but also challenges. We use the terms tension and paradox, and that's a through line in this report. But one other thing to note that we were most surprised by is that we're seeing new patterns of dispersal of Latino population. Latinos are not just going to places that were traditional strongholds. They're filling in, as you can see, in all areas of the region. Almost all municipalities grew their Latino population in the last decade. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Sylvia, who's going to talk further about these trends.
Thanks so much, Dan. You okay hearing me? So I also want to say that we're giving you like the highlights of this report. There's a lot more that's in it. So one of the things that we're not talking a lot about, some of the data that I'm going to present, we also have comparisons between Chicago and the suburbs, right? And we're not really highlighting that change. Other than to say what you might expect is that on the whole, Latinos in suburbia are a little bit better off socioeconomically on some of the indicators I'm going to talk about than they are in the city of Chicago. But they're also not doing as well as their non-Latinos in suburbia, right? So we're seeing somewhat upward mobility, but there are still large gaps between where the Latino community is and the non-Latino community. And that's some of what I'm going to highlight. But again, to pick up on one of the themes that you'll hear us say and reiterate in different ways, is that as a Latino community, we really are making significant contributions to the macro socioeconomic growth of the region and its economic vitality. But that growth and vitality has not been fully realized in the lives of far too many Latinos. So as I said, it's a complicated and nuanced story. We're making progress, but not as much as we would like. And while we're contributing overall to the economy, right, we're still not reaping all the benefits of the economic contributions that we're making. So Dan was talking about the overall growth. This chart basically says that when we look across the region, and the orange bar represents 2010, the blue bar represents 2020. And what this does, it lays out, we looked at all the municipalities, and there's over 200 across the region, and we put them by how many of those municipalities have less than 10% Latino population, how many had between 10 and 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 50, and then those last two sets of bars are Latino majority communities. And what we found is that those first two sets of bars, basically 3 out of 10 Latinos live in a community that is less than 20% Latino. Does that make sense? That we see almost 3 out of 10 in low-density Latino communities. Now, we don't know a lot about what we can say about them, other than that their overall community is only 10 to 20% Latino. And the inference is that there is some economic mobility of the folks that are living there because they're living in majority non-Latino communities. On the flip side, at the far end, those last two sets of bars, we also have about 30% of the Latino community that lives in Latino majority suburbs, right? So 3 out of 10 are living in suburbs that are 50% or more Latino. And interesting, and the report talks a lot more about this, as we saw the growth of the Latino community, we saw significant growth in those low-density Latino communities, and we saw much less growth in the Latino majority communities, presumably because they're already saturated and the Latino community is already majority Latino. But the highest bar in the middle there, right, is that we also see about 3 in 10 Latinos in the region living in communities that are 33 to 50% Latino. So we really see that there's a dispersal of Latinos living in low, medium, and high-density Latino communities. Make sense? For me, I was surprised to see the number that are living in these low-density communities and to see also that that's been one of the areas of greatest growth. Now, this next chart, there's a lot on here, and again, all this is in the report that you have, but these are some of the basic social economic indicators that we looked at. And so the top set of this top bar there, suburban Latinos made progress on several measures in the last decade. So there's good news here. What's represented here by the arrows is where we were in 2010 and where we're at in 2020. And I think we have this, that most of the green bars and even that purple bar are really good news on these indicators. And there's only one red bar, because some of them are going positive and some of them are negative, but it just, all the green and the purple bars are good trends. The red bar is not such a trend that we would not have liked to see. But in terms of education, that first one says -8. That means that in 2020, there were, we saw a decline in the number of Latinos that had less than a high school education. So there are fewer people with less than a high school education. Then the next bar, +4, we saw an increase in the number of Latino college graduates. So those are really good trends in terms of educational attainment and seeing progress. We looked at an indicator of income that we're calling households making $75,000 a year. That's a little bit above what the average, but we saw that's sort of a foothold into the middle class, right? If a household is making $75,000 a year or more, and the good news around that, it's a +16. We saw 16% more households that are earning at that level in 2020 than we did in 2010. Now, to unpack that a little bit, what we don't know is that that's household income. So from some of the other things that we're going to talk about, we think that that's people with A, multiple jobs, or B, multiple income earners in a household. May not just be a mother and a father, but how many of you know families where you're living with a tío or a tía, your compadre is living, right, to support the household income? And when we interviewed and talked to people out here, that was part of the story that we heard, of families doubling up to be able to make ends meet and to be able to buy a home. But we do see some positive economic trends there. We saw a little bit of a decline in home ownership. That's at -1, where we declined a percentage in the number of people that are owning their own homes. good news is that we saw a decline in the number of households that are overcrowded. And the measure of overcrowded is more than like one person per room. So we did see some improvement in that area. And the last two bars on that top set are overall poverty and childhood poverty. Some good news there too, and that we see less poverty. We see less poverty in 2020 than we did in 2010. Okay, with me? It's making sense, guys? Okay. So this bottom set of bars is, so even though we saw some positive gains and economic mobility improve, as we've seen the number of Latinos in the suburbs increase, the bottom set of bars tells us they're not doing nearly as well as their non-Latino neighbors, right? There still is a gap between where Latinos are and everyone else are in the communities where they live. So again, while we saw improvement in high school education, what we see, though, is that 31% of Latino adults have less than a high school education. So think about economic opportunity, job mobility, job skills, when you have less than a high school education. And that's only 5% for non-Latinos in the region. So again, a huge gap. Same with the bachelor's degree. We saw improvement, but that still means only 16% of Latino adults in the suburbs have a college degree, compared to 47% of everyone else. We saw those positive gains on those making over $75,000 a year, but there's still a gap because 59% of non-Latinos are in that same category. And while we saw home ownership rate is decent at 6 out of 10 Latinos owning their own homes, it's 3 out of 4, 76% for non-Latinos. And overcrowded housing, again, overcrowding is much more likely for Latino households than non-Latino households. And again, while we saw improvements in poverty, there still is a gap between poverty and childhood poverty between where Latinos are and non-Latinos in the region. So, big picture story, economic gains. We see some increased mobility, but what we still see is that there's a gap between where Latinos are and non-Latinos are in the region. And one of the themes that we highlight in the report is this theme of a paradox, right? That we're seeing both competing trends, both increasing at the same time. And so while we saw that increase in the number of households that earn over $75,000 a year, the next chart, and I'm gonna end on this, is what we also saw, one of the indicators that we looked at is what we call per capita income. That means how much income is there in a household for every person that lives there. So if a household earns $100,000 a year and there are 2 people in the household, it's a per capita income of $50,000. So this is, I think, one of the interesting measures of the disparity between Latinos and non-Latinos is that in every county, right, that top bar is actually where the white population is in the county, and that bottom purple bar is where the Latino community is. So in almost every case, the per capita income, the wealth in a household, is 2 to 3 times for white households for Latino households. Is it making sense? Okay, so I'm gonna stop there and turn it over to Teresa.
All right, I'll watch my time here. Alrighty, hello. What I'm going to do is look at measures that we took into account, something we call the Economic Hardship Index. This is an index that we created at the Great Cities Institute, and we've used it for neighborhoods in Chicago, and we thought it would be really relevant to apply it to some of these suburban municipalities. And so basically an index is a composite of several different indicators. And so and I'm sorry that there's so many words up here. The next 2 slides have lots of words too. I originally had them set to come in one at a time, but what you can see here that this composite index includes things like unemployment rates. It includes education level, per capita income level, which is a different calculation, right, to look at per capita versus household income, levels of poverty, housing density, as well then as dependency population. So combining all those indicators, we took every suburban area, suburban community, and we ranked them, and they were ranked into 5 categories, either very high hardship level, high hardship, moderate level, low level, or very low level. And so what we then once we did that, we can go to the next slide, what we wanted to do then is say, then where are Latinos living by level of hardship? Now, part of that is because so much of the narrative on moving to the suburbs, right? As you're moving to the suburbs and you're moving into higher income areas. But then there was this trend since the 80s that was referred to as the suburbanization of poverty. So kind of what we wanted to get a feel for is what is the degree to which Latinos, as they move into the suburbs, are experiencing levels of hardship. And that was the rationale for using these indicators to do that. So we created hardship levels for using ACS data for back in, what do we use for those? The 2006 through 2010, and then we compare that to 2017 to 2021, the 5-year estimates. And so then we compared it over time, and then we juxtaposed it in relationship to where there's the greatest growth. So what you can see there then by looking at this is that the percentage of Latinos, or the numbers of Latinos that are moving into high hardship areas, has actually decreased. And so that's a good thing, right? That that the level of hardship, we're not just moving into high levels, in communities with high levels of hardship, but that we're also moving into levels of low level of hardship, although still the highest concentration is in areas where there is a high level, not very high level, but high level. And so there's good news in there, but again, simultaneously, we're still living in high areas, but also we also are moving into areas where there are low levels of hardship. And so I think the point is that the sort of distribution is mixed. It sort of fits within the story of the paradox. We're seeing improvements at the same time that we're still seeing challenges and opportunities here. And I think to some of the points that Sylvia made about juxtaposing our conditions in relationship to to non-Latinos in these areas, that we're still seeing relative levels of hardship. And I do want to highlight that household income versus per capita income, again, because remember, we tend to have, and you'll find this in census data as well, we tend to have higher numbers of people in our households. So which is why if you hear people say, well, we have higher household income, what you want to ask for, what's the per capita income? Because we're going to have the higher levels of household because of the ways in which Latinos tend to come together and have multi-general households and pool their resources together. This is one of the many assets of Latinos, right? One of the many ways in which we are creative, one of the many ways in which we are very family-oriented, very community-oriented, and the way we come together. One of the, I think, primary characteristics of us is the ways in which we are so entrepreneurial and so resourceful. And that's one of the ways that we do that. But nonetheless, this shows that, though, that we are still, to some degree, still concentrated in areas, even though that concentration is not as severe, in areas where there is the indicators, or there's higher unemployment, lower levels of education, and so on. And all of this, of course, has policy implications for the kinds of things we need to demand, right? Whether, beginning with, of course, the representation, and as you pointed out, Commissioner, we're seeing an increase in representation, but that representation becomes really critical as we take on challenges around education. We've got to increase our levels of education, for example, as we take on issues of wage disparity. Other work that we've done at Great Cities, for example, has shown that we tend to be concentrated in the lowest wage occupations within certain industries. And so we've got to address the sort of the wage disparities. And so there are some things at the end of the report that also begin to get at some of the policy implications. But these are the kinds of things that we hope that you will do with this data, is use the data to think about, well, what are the policy issues that we need to push? Next slide. Where's the growth by Latinos in hardship, by hardship level? And again, most of that growth occurred in moderate hardship suburbs, 40%, 29% in lower hardship areas. And so again, to make that point that we're tending to grow away from the higher hardship areas, even though we still have concentrations in high hardship areas like Cicero, Waukegan, Carpetsonsville, Melrose Park, and Hanover Park, as well as high hardship areas like Aurora, Elgin, which fits into this area, Joliet, Berwyn, and Addison. So places like Berwyn, for example, where you have a population, majority of Latinos there of well over 80%. It's closer to 90% of the concentration there. And so in areas where we have high concentrations of our population, we're also still seeing high levels of hardship. So again, this is just to give you a taste. I apologize for the density of these slides, but I think you've got the papers in front of you and can break it down. But what we want to do by using this is to begin to get the sense, right, of again, this paradoxical story. On one hand, there's improvement. On the other hand, challenges remain.
And on that note of challenges remaining, I'm going to close this out with noting, to echo what Teresa told you, there are a lot of policy implications with this data, and we don't have the time to get into all of them. We hope that an outgrowth of this is that you all as elected officials, organizers, stakeholders can use this and be a part of thinking through policy solutions. But clearly education, employment, housing are very important. But I put this map up here just to illustrate one thing that caught our eye in the same way that we think all of these are important, not saying that transportation is the only one. But if you look at this map, this shows what percentage moderate income families spend on transportation. And if you look at that red ring in the outer ring suburbs, which mirrors where we're seeing the biggest growth in Latino population, you see in these places that families spend oftentimes up to 30% of their income. A moderate income family, 30% of their income going to transportation. So this is a big trade-off, we think, that a lot of Latino families are likely making to move out to a newer suburb that's farther out. Housing may be more affordable. School options may be better, or at least more something in line with what Latino families are looking for. However, 30% is a massive amount for a family to spend on transportation, and with that comes rising commute times as well, taking people away from their families, away from other opportunities. And so we know that transportation is a big challenge for this region, and we know we have fiscal cliffs coming up with federal support being cut off. So this is just one area to think about. And we hope folks who are organizing around, Latino issues in particular can use this to think about and advocate for transportation solutions, because they're critical for Latino families as they move farther out in the suburbs.
And I neglected to mention that we also, while we didn't spend a lot of time on it in the report, we would be remiss if we didn't speak just a little bit to some of the health implications, which are pretty dramatic given we know in the wake of COVID, given that we know that Latinos have the highest rates of being uninsured. We are the most impacted by long-term COVID, which we are beginning to understand has really dramatic consequences for not only for health, but for ability to work and be able to contribute to society. We know that even pre-COVID, for those of you that are health folks in the room, we've seen the most dramatic declines in life expectancy for Latinos compared to all other groups. And there's such a correlation between health status and socioeconomic indicators and people's economic well-being. So we talk a little bit about what that means in terms of declining life expectancy. And finally, the last issue that we wanted to put on the table that really requires a lot more conversation is that regrettably, we've seen the greatest increases in maternal mortality among Latina mothers, a higher incidence of Latino mortality, maternal mortality than it is for any other group. And so our reason for putting it in the report is we're not having enough conversation on any of what the long-term health implications are for any of these indicators. I'll stop with that.
Yeah, we can clap. That was a lot of information. So we will be opening up the floor for questions from the audience. And I want to highlight something that I read in the report that I found very interesting, and this sentence probably encompasses a lot of the progress that has been highlighted today. But this is a sentence from the report, and it says, "The picture painted by these data, as demonstrated throughout this report, depicts Latinos as doing more with less. Imagine then the scale of their contribution if true equity were realized." And I think that really stood out to me. And if any one of you want to expand on that, and anecdotally what you heard, and why this work matters.
Go first, I'll go after you. All right. That's a great question. Wow. You know, I think I began to get a little bit at it when I was talking about, for example, the entrepreneurial spirit, right? The resourcefulness, but you know, and also even the ways in which we think collectively, the way we think in terms of community. I think more now than ever, we need that sense of like thinking about familia, thinking about how we connect among ourselves, right, as a society. So I think culturally, there's something really valuable about our presence. I mean, even if I think about Puerto Ricans, for example, their concept of revolu, you know, and just this ways in which we can, I think, bring a certain kind of spirit. And so what becomes important, I think, as we grow further, even in our presence and in our importance, I think we make sure that we don't do it in a way that we're giving up fundamentally who we are. If I can use that language, right, that there is some notion of fundamentally who we are, right? But at least, I mean, there's a kind of, there's an importance that we are there's a sense that we are connected to one another, right? That we are as a society important to one another. And I think the extent to which we are able to express ourselves in ways that are together, you know, that our power is together. I mean, I see that with some of the young elected officials, for example, even at the state level, at the various other levels of government, there's a real kind of connectedness. And so I guess that's, I mean, I might say more about the economy. I tend to think in terms of the economy. I'm a political economist, right? But if I think culturally, I think that's an important contribution, an important aspect of our presence.
Thank you. I would just add, I think Sylvia made this point earlier about per capita income. I think that's one of the biggest trends that reflects this idea of doing more with less, that Latinos are probably have more working members of their family than most households in order to achieve, you know, parity, right? So we saw that there's some positive trends when you think of household income going up, but per capita income being still having staggeringly high gaps between Latinos and white families, for example. I think that shows that reflects some trends that we know and we learned from COVID, right? That Latinos have the highest labor force participation rate of any racial or ethnic group, are more likely to be employed in essential jobs. So it's just when you piece together from different data sources, you start to get a picture of how Latino families are making gains, and it's through a lot of hard work, it's through a lot of sacrifice, and it's you know, and it speaks to the need to have income and jobs that are higher wage that can help move families to close these gaps to non-Latino and white families.
And in addition to what my colleagues have said, just to underscore some of what we're saying in this report, we're driving population growth. We talk in the report about spending power and how much our spending power has increased. We're driving home ownership growth, and to be explicit, because our population is growing, because we have a lot of young families that are forming, we are buying the bulk of new housing in the region, right? So if we're making all these economic contributions, right, we really are contributing not just to our own family's economic vitality, but to the state's economic vitality. But we're doing that with less because we have the lowest per capita income, we have the highest proportion of people. The report says over 60% of Latino workers who work under $15 an hour or less, right? So we're making all these economic contributions, but we're doing it with lower income, lower wages, right? So again, to the tail end of the quote, then how much better off and how much more we'd be contributing if we had economic parity. And that's obviously one of the goals that we're trying to attain.
You know, and just very quickly, I mean, I think we're all bringing forward this point, but I want to also really highlight, and I mentioned, for example, when I was talking about Elgin, we first came here because we worked on the railroads, right, and in the fields. I mean, our role to the economy as laborers, but Sylvia also mentioned, right, for example, our high rates of COVID and our high rates of long-term COVID. It was because of the industries and the occupations that we were in. And I think as we're talking about sort of the greatness of the Latino population and even some of the challenges, I think this, you know, there's a lot of people who are working hard at the grassroots level to address the issues of conditions in the workplace. And I think that this becomes a really, really important policy and organizing issue for us. While we're making all these contributions, we shouldn't be the sacrificial lambs for this economy. And so, yeah, we're entrepreneurs, and yeah, we're consumers, and yeah, we've seen increases in the numbers of people getting education and becoming part of the professional class, right? But a bulk of our population is still working in some very, very difficult, I dare say even exploitative conditions, right, with respect to the nature of work. And I think that is something you know, and we've actually got some data a report that we did back in, that I was involved in 35 years ago, and we did an update of that. And our role still concentrated in certain industries and certain occupations in those industries. We still have the lowest wages of any other group, and that has remained consistent. So I don't want to sort of gloss over that either. I mean, I think we need to, because all of us, probably most of us, if not all of us, come from backgrounds where the issue of work is an important family and household issue. So just wanted to make sure that got in there. So imagine how great, right, if we were treated fairly in the workplace.
And I think this was also brought up in the report, but this answers the question as to why there's much more difficulty accumulating generational wealth. And even like we're buying houses, right? But are those houses being, you know, passed down to generations? Are they being kept in the family? Or these? I mean, there's so many questions about that. And I guess one of the other things I think I want to know too is, from speaking to the people you interviewed, what are some of those driving forces of moving to the suburbs and the trade-offs? You mentioned transportation, but if you can just expand a little bit more on that. If they're moving to more hardship areas, what is the trade-off for that?
Well, on your first point, one of the points that it said, there's a lot more in this report, that as we've seen the Latino community expand into the suburbs, one of the things that was really striking for me is that 75% of Latinos reside in census tracts that have a lower median home ownership than the median for the arena, for the geographic region, right? So we're moving to census tracts where the median home value is less than what it is for the region. Does that make sense? But 75%. So one of the issues in creating wealth, we always think about home ownership as wealth, but you can only have wealth if your home value is appreciating. And 75% of our community lives in the lowest 20% of census tracts with home value. On the other hand, in terms of growth, we did see a good number of Latinos that were saw a considerable growth to people who were moving to areas that had higher home values than the region. But so again, the paradox, right? Moving to lower segment of the community, lower portion of the community to high wealth areas, and a much greater portion living in low wealth housing value areas. But the biggest reason, and we talked to a number, and want to thank the groups that helped to facilitate some of the conversations that we had, You know, the two big drivers of moving to suburbia and living in suburbia are better schools and safety. I mean, I think that's what it is. I don't know if it's any different for the Latino community than it is for other groups, but those are certainly two of the biggest drivers.
Yeah, great points. One of the things I also want to point out is that you know, like for example, in Elgin, people came to Elgin, they didn't go like to Chicago and come to Elgin. They first came to Elgin, they came straight to Elgin, right? And you see that in a lot of other suburbs. Melrose Park, for example, there was a population that went straight to Melrose Park. There's a lot of Latinos, for example, who are not going to Chicago. They are not going to Chicago first. They're coming straight to these suburban communities, and they're working in the factories, and they're working in the different areas, right, in the suburbs. At the same time, a lot of people are leaving Chicago and coming to the suburbs because of gentrification of their neighborhoods in Chicago. So we've got a lot of personal stories. I'm sure I see a lot of you nodding, right, of people that we know that were forced out of Logan Square, for example, were forced out of Pilsen, right, that had left those communities because they can't afford to be there anymore. And so if we're talking just within the city of Chicago, for example, the biggest issue there is affordability and the gentrification of our neighborhoods. So while we're celebrating the presence of Latinos in Chicago, we should not forget that some of that is also because of displacement that's happening to Latinos in the city of Chicago.
I guess my other final question that I think is important to talk about is, we know Latinos are very diverse, right? And depending on what generation you are from or you belong to, you do have different opportunities. So can you talk about these families in general? Are we talking first, second, third generation, or are we talking newly arrived immigrants?
Yeah.
Who are we talking about?
So we want to make sure we can get to our community respondents. So just real briefly, I'll say that one of the big things that we've seen is that we've seen 20 years ago, 2 out of 3 Latino adults was an immigrant. Today it's half. So we've seen a decline in the number of adults that are immigrants, but we've also seen is immigration has slowed down. And when we saw this growth, the report talks about, you know, the 1.2 million Latinos now living in suburbia. The growth of that is being driven by US-born Latinos. So over 80%, I think it's over 80% of that growth is by people who are born in the US. So the story of migration driving growth, which was true in the 80s and 90s, is no longer true, right? So we are acculturating, we are adapting, we see more second generation families, but the overall story is still true that many households are still an immigrant parent. Half of households have an immigrant parent and or children of immigrants.
All right, thank you so much. I think we could talk about this all day long, but we want to give sort of how this applies to the community or how it resonates with the community. And for that, we have community respondents to talk a little bit about that. We were expecting to have Dianha Ortega, I'm not sure about her last Ehreth, thank you, the executive director of the Centro de Informacion. But in her place, we have Naomi Rojas, who will be here speaking with her, and then for her, and then we also have Gloria Trejo, who is the assistant superintendent for teaching and learning at the West Chicago District 33. And we want to hear from you both just what resonates with you when reading the report and how they are working with the community members on an everyday basis and how this information applies to them.
So hello everyone. As mentioned, my name is Naomi Rojas and I am speaking on behalf of Dianha Ortega-Ehreth. Thank you to the Latino Policy Forum for the opportunity to respond to this important research at this community event here in Elgin. Elgin is a very diverse community, but as your research points out, diversity is not the same as equity. The research findings, which I find most disheartening, are Latino children are twice as likely to live in poverty as non-Latino children. Non-Latino per capita income in King County is more than twice as much as the Latino per capita income in King County. Latinos are 3 to 6 times more likely to be uninsured than whites. Latinos are 6 times as likely to live in overcrowded conditions. Latinos have seen an alarming decrease in life expectancy and increase in maternal mortality. I am confident that everyone in this room can put these stories to these kinds of statistics, even their own. We see these struggles in almost every client who comes to Centro. One longtime client recently came to renew her DACA and work permit. She recently divorced her husband of 5 years and partner of over 10 years, moved back home with her parents in Elgin. Now, she is a single mother of 4 children, all under the age of 13, and makes less than $26,000 annually and has never been a homeowner. Another client arrived in the U.S. through the Darien Jungle in Panama. She reached the Texas border with her 2 children, ages 6 and 11. At Centro, she received a number of services, one being access to health care for her children. Yet another Centro client recently found the immense courage to report her partner, who was physically abusing her for years. While this was a brave and bold and important step, she is now facing the new challenge of taking on household expenses alone. A mother of a 1-year-old daughter who has no formal education and has not been able to secure a stable job. She was evicted from her home and sought refuge in her sister's basement, which is in poor condition. She has turned to staffing agencies to provide for herself and, more importantly, to ensure a brighter future for her daughter. Centro has given her a number of resources to help empower her towards stability and independence. There are hundreds, thousands more stories like this that Centro staff hears each year about Latinos who fit within various categories of hardship. There is a theme throughout these stories that I have recognized, and that theme is that all it takes is one life crisis to fall into hardships, and one hardship often leads to another. Economic mobility is fragile like this when you don't have the generational wealth. Further, to get out of this hardship, one needs to know about the resources available in the community, trust the people offering these resources, time to schedule and make appointments, time for gathering necessary paperwork, time to coordinate childcare, transportation, and more, and patience and hope. This report does offer glimpses of hope into the hard work that has been going on in the Latino population for decades. Despite the gaps with non-Latino counterparts, there are impressive gains in home ownership and education within the Latino community. Progress is progress. And especially given the challenges brought on from the pandemic, the greater the probability that people are taking care of extended family members, language barriers, and more, these gains prove that we are muy movidos, determined and taking advantage of the opportunities offered, and that these kinds of gains should be celebrated. I can't wait to hear about the many more gains we will make in the next 10 years. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gloria Trejo, and I have been working in education for 27 years, and in the past 23 years, I've been working in the suburbs, West Chicago, and in my experience working as an educator in the suburbs is that we are making some advances with our students going to college. However, we're not offering them the same experiences as their peers. As far as our families, what I have seen is, yes, what I have seen in my experiences, I've seen multiple families living in apartments, and we have made advances where they are becoming homeowners. However, what I do see, and as the report states that the households are increasing the income, I have seen multiple families living in a household. So while we do see advancement, I do think that there's still a lot of work to be done, and that starts with our education, providing and promoting and giving the students the experiences of what is out there, scholarships, supporting families with what financial aid looks like, and so there is a lot of work that still needs to be done.
All right. Thank you so much to both of you. And with that said, I think we have time for some questions from the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand and we'll come up to you with a microphone. And these can either be in English or Spanish.
Hi, everyone. Henry Saguirre, Director of Strategy from the Salvation Army. Super quick question. I know you touched on it before, Sylvia, the idea of acculturation. I know it's something that's extremely difficult to measure based on the in-depth study that the three of you did. But I guess my question maybe for all of us, are there any research pieces out there that correlate acculturation with movement out of a metropolitan area, or let's say, well, out of Chicago? I know my question's a little long-winded, but it's more like whenever I attend functions like these, I always am fascinated by acculturation because it's just so difficult knowing how diverse Latinos are. It's not easy to measure.
I was going to answer, it's a great question, and it's not something we have data on or I'm aware of any studies on, but I think your analysis is right on, and it's something that was top of mind. Thinking about the suburbs and thinking about, places like Pilsen and Little Village in the city and, Humboldt Park that had such symbols, institutions, political power and representation and organizations that new places that Latinos are populating probably do not have, right? So I think, a big focus in the future, I think, is building that political power and representation that does not exist in the suburbs in a lot of places. So I appreciate your question, and I wish I knew an answer of a data source, but I think your analysis is right on to be concerned about that.
So your question took me to my sociological side, right? And the first thing I thought, okay, what are going to be our indicators of acculturation? How would we measure it, right? Because there's so many different dimensions to it, and part of what you're asking is once we sort of determine what are the different ways we might measure it, what is its impact on our ability to be successful, right? And it's a very deep question, right? I think that could lead to all kinds of deep conversation, but. Well, and part of the challenge is part of the question is, do we need to acculturate to be successful? That's part of, I think, underlying that. And I think part of you in my earlier comments were kind of along the lines of pitching like no, right? And I remember asking this in graduate school. Do we need to be like them to be successful? No, right? So how do we bring more of ourselves forward, right? And so. So I think it's an important question to sort of to talk about how it is we can preserve that which is best about us, right? And still be because even then, what do we mean by success, right? Wealth generation building, measures of happiness, measures of health, whatever we might come up with to measure our degrees of happiness, right? But I think that we need to really think about, as with the diversity of Latinos, and you're for sure right about that, how do we be, whatever we might define success as, how do we become successful without changing, who we are? And I would sort of make a pitch that we shouldn't have to acculturate to be successful, right? That we should bring value to, and the stew, and not a melting pot, it's a stew, right?
My name is Paola Velasquez, and I work with Illinois Manufacturing Excellence Center. So I work with manufacturers to help improve some of the conditions, the culture, create some equity. So my question is around retirees. So my parents retired back to Colombia. Has there been any research on the retirees that have left the United States because their retirement they can't afford the living cost here? So they could have impacted or contributed to the economy had they stayed here in the country. But I was just curious if there's been any research on that and how that would have impacted it.
I don't know of any. Do you guys know of any?
I had a colleague at Notre Dame, Dr. Karen Richmond, that did 2 studies on Latino retirement. I don't know if it particularly addresses the questions that you ask, but I would say that situation is not unique to just Latinos. I mean, there are many. You go anywhere in Latin America, and you see cities of expats of Americans that are living in Latin America and other places around the world. So, but we do know, and from those studies, that, you know, Latinos have very low levels of retirement plans. I mean, that's true for a lot of Americans in general, but it's particularly true for Latinos because of the kinds of jobs that they have that haven't had retirement plans, and people able to contribute in that way.
But since you mentioned manufacturing, I want to throw something in that's slightly related to what you've asked here, which is the issue of succession. We did a study a few years back looking at